Welcome to The Explainer. You know, when we hear the word globalization, it's super easy to just picture our modern world, right? We think of the internet, massive cargo ships, airplanes, or instantly zipping money from one continent to another. But what if I told you that globalization isn't some modern economic invention at all? No way. It's actually a thousands of years old process. Throughout history, people have been traveling incredibly long distances for work, for knowledge, for spiritual reasons, or even just to escape danger. And as they traveled, they brought their goods, their ideas, and yeah, sometimes even diseases along for the ride. So today, we're going to trace the absolutely fascinating and sometimes pretty dark timeline of how our deeply interconnected world was actually built.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap. We'll start with the ancient global network, move on to 16th century conquests, the 19th century boom, how technology shrinks the world, the dark side of empire, and finally, wrap up with India's shifting global role.
Let's kick things off with Section 1, the ancient global network. To really understand the deep, pre-modern roots of our interconnected world, we've got to rewind the clock, way back. Long before steamships and the telegraph, cultures were already actively sharing knowledge, goods, and beliefs. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly what I mean. As early as 3000 BCE, ancient civilizations like the Indus Valley were trading with places as far away as West Asia. This wasn't just a localized economy. We're talking about societies that have been connected for a very, very long time. By the time we hit the Silk Roads, which peaked and ran well into the 15th century, we see these massive overland and sea routes linking Asia with Europe and northern Africa. And it wasn't just Chinese silk moving along these routes. It was pottery, Indian and Southeast Asian textiles, spices, all being exchanged for gold and silver flowing back from Europe to Asia. And it wasn't just physical goods either. Ideas spread like wildfire. Buddhism, for instance, spread from India out through these very same Silk Roads.
Take food, for example. Early traders and travelers introduced entirely new crops to totally different lands. It's widely believed that noodles from China actually made their way west and evolved into spaghetti. Or that Arab traders brought pasta to Italy. Wild, right? But it goes even deeper than that. Think about potatoes, tomatoes, chilies, and corn. These foods were completely unknown in Europe and Asia until just about 500 years ago. They actually originated in the Americas, grown by Native Americans, and were introduced globally after Christopher Columbus's voyages. These new crops fundamentally changed lives. In Europe, the poor suddenly ate better and lived longer, all thanks to the humble potato. In fact, in Ireland, peasants became so utterly dependent on the potato that when a disease ruined the crop in the 1840s, vast numbers of people tragically died of hunger.
All right, moving on to Section 2, 16th century conquests.
Now, this is the era when European sailors finally found new sea routes to Asia and the Americas, and suddenly the world started to feel significantly smaller. While the older, pre-modern silk routes were mostly overland, relatively slow, and focused heavily on luxury goods like silk and spices, the 16th century brought a massive dramatic shift. The Indian Ocean had already been this bustling hub of trade, right? But when Europeans arrived, they dramatically expanded and redirected all that wealth toward Europe. Plus, the discovery of the Americas unlocked massive new lands, crops, and minerals. Silver mined from Peru and Mexico suddenly just poured into Europe, making it incredibly rich and helping finance its trade with Asia. This wealth fundamentally shifted the world's trading center. Before this point, China and India were actually among the world's richest countries, completely dominating Asian trade. But as China kind of limited its overseas activities and the Americas opened up, the center of global trade swung decisively over to Europe.
But you might be wondering, how did European powers like Spain and Portugal conquer the Americas so swiftly? Well, it wasn't solely due to military superiority. A massive, absolutely crucial factor was biological. The conquerors brought diseases like smallpox with them. Because the Americas had been isolated for so long, Native American populations had absolutely zero natural immunity to these foreign diseases. It was devastating. Smallpox ravaged these communities, which basically paved the way for European dominance. And that dominance, tragically, soon led to the forced labor of African slaves on cotton and sugar plantations, just to supply growing European markets.
Let's jump into Section 3, the 19th century boom.
So if the 16th century laid the groundwork, the period between 1815 and 1914 brought an absolute explosion of economic, social, and technological transformation. Economists usually look at this era through three massively interconnected flows. So the crucial point is understanding these three flows. First, we have the flow of trade. This is the massive movement of bulk goods, things like cloth or wheat. Second, the flow of labor, meaning mass migration of people moving across the globe just to find jobs.
And third, the flow of capital. So money moving across borders for short-term or long-term financial investments. You really can't understand the 19th century world economy without looking at how these three flows completely intertwined and influence people's everyday lives on a totally global scale.
Let's look at a really specific chain reaction that fueled these flows. Traditionally, countries wanted to grow their own food, self-sufficiency, right? But in industrializing Britain, the population was booming, cities were growing fast, and food demand skyrocketed. So the government initially passed what were called the Corn Laws to restrict food imports and protect their local farmers. Well, the result? Food prices absolutely shot up. Industrialists and city dwellers protested these high prices, ultimately forcing the government to abolish the Corn Laws. Suddenly, Britain was importing massive amounts of cheap food. British agriculture just couldn't compete, farmers lost their jobs, and people had to migrate. But globally, this created a massive, cheap agricultural boom. Countries like America, Australia, and Russia rapidly increased their food production just to feed Britain.
And to support this booming global agricultural economy, infrastructure had to be built, which required massive amounts of labor. 150 million. Let that sink in. That is the staggering number of people globally who moved in the 19th century in search of better opportunities. To put that into perspective, around 50 million Europeans alone migrated to America and Australia. People were literally packing up and moving across the earth to grow food far, far away from where it was actually going to be consumed.
Which brings us to Section 4, Technology Shrinks the World.
Now, you obviously can't move millions of people or millions of tons of wheat without incredible technological leaps. We're talking faster railways, larger steamships, and the telegraph connecting markets almost instantly. But let's focus on one incredibly specific, real game-changer of an invention: refrigerated ships. Before the 1870s, if Europe wanted meat from America, they had to ship live animals across the ocean. It was super expensive, took up a ton of space, and sadly, a lot of the animals died or became unfit to eat along the journey. But once ships were actually equipped with refrigeration, animals could be slaughtered in America, Australia, or New Zealand and shipped frozen straight to Europe. This drastically lowered shipping costs, and suddenly, the poor in Europe could actually afford meat. It vastly improved their diets and even promoted social stability back home, which interestingly enough helped governments gain domestic support for even further imperialism abroad.
So, we're seeing cheaper food, better technology, and this booming global trade. But we really have to pause here and ask, did a rapidly connected world actually benefit everyone?
That leads us right into Section 5, the dark side of empire.
The answer to that question, unfortunately, is a resounding no. For many countries, integration into this booming global economy meant a devastating loss of freedom and the utter destruction of local livelihoods. Now, what's really interesting about this next part is the sheer administrative detachment of the era. It was tragic. In 1885, at the Berlin Conference, major European powers literally met in a room to just carve up a map of Africa. They drew arbitrary borders and divided the entire continent among themselves: Britain, France, Belgium, Germany, with almost zero regard for the complex societies, cultures, and people actually living there. They just wanted Africa's vast land and mineral resources to feed their own global economic machine.
But the Europeans faced a big problem in Africa. The local populations already had plenty of land and livestock. They didn't want or need to work for wages in European mines or on plantations. So, to force them into the labor market, colonizers imposed heavy taxes and even changed inheritance laws. But the most devastating blow was biological: 90%. In the late 1880s, infected cattle brought over from British Asia to feed Italian soldiers introduced a cattle plague called rinderpest. It spread like wildfire across Africa, killing 90% of the continent's cattle. This catastrophic loss completely destroyed African livelihoods. Colonizers then simply seized the few remaining cattle, effectively forcing the local population into the wage labor market just to survive.
Another very dark reality of this era was indentured labor. As the global agricultural boom demanded more and more hands, hundreds of thousands of Indian and Chinese workers were sent worldwide. They were often recruited under completely deceptive contracts about their living conditions, sent to work on plantations and in mines in places like the Caribbean, Fiji, and Mauritius. The conditions were brutal, with almost no legal protection whatsoever. In fact, it was frequently described as a new form of slavery. Yet, even in the midst of this immense hardship, workers found ways to survive and blend their traditions together. Over in the Caribbean, for example, the blending of these different cultures eventually gave rise to entirely new art forms like chutney music. Let's move on to our final chapter, Section 6, India's Shifting Global Role. India provides a perfect lens to see how this newly industrialized global economy completely flipped ancient trade dynamics on their head. Let's move to and see how this builds. Historically, India was incredibly famous for exporting fine, manufactured cotton textiles to Europe. But as British cotton industries grew during their Industrial Revolution, they lobbied their government to block Indian cloth. As manufactured exports from India crashed, their raw material exports soared. Take a look at the numbers. India's raw cotton exports jumped from just 5% of their total exports in 1812 all the way up to 35% by 1871. India was fundamentally transformed from a rich manufacturer into merely a supplier of raw materials for British factories.
The exact mechanics of this economic shift were precise, and they were devastating. When Britain imposed tariffs on imported cloth, Indian manufactured cotton exports plummeted to below 3%. Furthermore, Britain aggressively exported Indian-grown opium to China, using those massive profits to fund its own tea imports. Finally, British manufactured goods flooded right back into India. The ultimate outcome of the whole shebang: Britain extracted a massive trade surplus from India. They essentially used Indian resources, Indian markets, and Indian labor to balance their own global trade deficits and fund their colonial administration. As we wrap up this explainer, I want you to consider this thought. The global networks that deliver our food and goods today were built on a complex history of both incredible shared culture and profound exploitation. The globalization we experience today didn't just magically appear overnight with the invention of the internet. It's the result of thousands of years of human movement, from ancient Silk Roads and shared crops to staggering technological leaps, all deeply, deeply intertwined with colonial conquest and the painful restructuring of global economies. So the next time you buy a product from across the world, ask yourself, what is the true, hidden historical cost of the interconnected world we live in today? Thank you so much for joining me on this journey. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.